Hey guys, tonight we time travel to a place where the sun rises over limestone temples where palm trees sway gently along a sleepy riverbank and the smell of baking barley bread hangs lazily in the warm air. Wapos. We're in ancient Egypt now. Barefoot on sandy stone, eyelids heavy, your linen tunic brushing quietly against your knees. Few ibis pick at something left behind in the courtyard. Possibly date, possibly bit of boiled fish you won. Ye know for sure. But one thing is clear, the ancient Egyptians, despite all their pyramids, scarabs, and gods with falcon heads, had something deeply human in common with you. They had leftovers, a lot of them, and tonight Wepos are going to explore what they did with them. Sure, Wapos have you probably seen grand murals of pharaohs feasting on roasted oxen or reclining with cups of sweet wine, but what happens after the banquet ends? What happens when the fig platter's picked over, the chickpea stupos, escon lukewarm, and the duck leg is half chewed? Here's hint, you probably wouldn't survive week in their kitchens. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Always love seeing how far this little sleepy history club stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up, or rather you open your eyes, but you're not quite awake. The air smells faintly of onions, tamara, squid smoke, and the trace of fish the tapos is just starting to go questionable. Tapos, three standing inside a modest home in a village not far from Thebes. The walls are whitewashed mud brick, cool to the touch. Outside, the Nile glints like a ribbon of silver under the fading light. But inside, it's dinner time. The woman of the house hums softly as she stirs something thick and bubbling in wide clay pot. Her youngest, already gnawing on the crust of yesterday's flatbread. You settle onto woven mat in the corner. No one sees you. Wapozari just shadow tonight, quiet observer. Dinners will humble, ladle full of lentil porridge, side of leeks boiled until soft, maybe grilled tilapia if it's been lucky day at the river. Most meals were meatless for regular Egyptians. Cattle and ducks were reserved for feasts, temple offerings, or the wealthy, whose pyramids have aged better than their lunch habits. Chickpeas, barley, onions, and the ever-present bread. These were daily staples. The bread is character in its own right. Dense, dark, almost sullen. You bite into it and your teeth nearly lose the will to go on. Grains of sand sometimes found their way into the dough, giving a lovely gritty texture that's part exfoliant, part dental crisis. But hey, it's filling, and when it's stale, that's when the real creativity begins. Most families didn't waste food. It simply wasn't an option. The effort to grind grain, gather fuel, and haul water made every bite precious. So the porridge from yesterday might become the stuffing for today's roasted eggplant. Bread crusts got soaked and fried. Leftover lentils went into tomorrow's stew or were rolled into little patties and grilled. Not quite Michelin star experience, but deeply sustainable. Historians still argue whether this economy of leftovers was out of necessity or ritual. Some believe even the method of reusing food followed spiritual logic. Nothing wasted, all things returned to balance. Others say, well, it was just common sense in Desser where nothing came easy. And then there's that peculiar little side dish on your hostapos, this table. It looks like some mashed dates with herbs, maybe sprinkle of coriander. Sweet, tart, and fragrant. Probably yesterday's dried fruit softened with wine. Not bad. It lingers pleasantly on your tongue just as the stars begin to appear outside. As the family finishes up, scraps are carefully sorted. What's too stale even for hungry child is placed aside. For the goats, or maybe the hens, owns are saved for soup. And anything too far gone, that oddly enough, still has purpose. Later you'll see how even rotten bread can make comeback as medicine, but for now your eyelids are heavy, the embers in the fire crackle gently. One of the children is already asleep, face sticky with figs. The mother tucks away the leftover lentil mesh into a sealed jar. It'll be breakfast tomorrow. You lie back, staring at the woven reed ceiling, listening to lullaby being hummed in dialect no longer spoken. Outside, dog barks at the wind. Donkey brays from somewhere behind the house. Inside, it's calm, warm, slow. You're full of lentils. Bread and stories you're only just beginning to digest. Morning in ancient Egypt doesn't exactly hit you like trop. It glides in gently, golden and slow, like warm honey dripping over limestone. The light is soft and dusty, and the village is already awake. You stretch under an imaginary linen sheet and wander outside. Roosters have opinions, as always. Goats bleat. Somewhere a child drops clay bowl, and nobody gets mad. Breakfast is not entirely different from dinner. Remember that lentil mesh stored away in the clay jar last night? She's back at it, stirring it gently into pot over smoldering embers, adding water. some garlic, and crumble of old cheese that abos, as technically past its prime. But let's not be judgy. Nothing here goes to waste if it can be reworked, disguised, or dunked in sour beer. Speaking of which, your first sip of morning beer hits like liquid bread left on windowsill too long. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, sludgy, and far from the bubbly pints we know today. Brewed from partly baked loaves of barley bread and fermented with wild yeast, it was packed with fiber, nutrients, and just enough alcohol to take the edge off being awake. You chew it more than sip it. If your breakfast looks like brown soup and drinks like oatmeal with attitude, you're doing it right. Food here isn't just fuel, it's rhythm cycle. Most homes had just one oven, small dome-shaped affair out in the courtyard. The bread, baked in massive batches, usually enough for a week, and naturally, some of it hardened faster than a temple guard's frown. Those stale loaves, dunked in broth, rehydrated, fed to animals, sometimes ground back into flour, sand, and all. And if the smell turned questionable, that's what incense was for. Historians still debate just how structured the meal schedule was. Some say breakfast was must, others argue people simply snacked all day between temple shifts and irrigation work. Given the heat, formality wasn't a tea high on the list. What mattered was using every scrap. By midday, the village air smells like baking onions and wet clay. You step into another home now, this one with a slightly better view of the Nile and a fig tree out back. A pot of yesterday's stew is bubbling lazily. It's probably lentils again, maybe with some fava beans added, maybe not. You hear the mother scolding her son for not finishing his bread from earlier. He sulks and tosses it to the chickens. She throws him look that could curdle milk. Leftovers weren't just leftovers. They were reputation, responsive, even respect for the land. You don't waste what took hours to grow, harvest, grind, and cook. You reimagine it. Let's talk a little more about that fish. The Nile was teeming with tilapia and catfish, and fish was a staple source of protein. It was often sun-dried or salt-cured, which made it more shelf-stable, but also more pungent, especially on day 3. The scent could knock out seasoned priests if not stored properly. But even those smelly bits were repurposed, ground into paste for sauces or added to porridges, which sounds worse than it tasted, probably. A strange little discovery from a dig site near us once revealed a stash of fish bones wrapped in linen tucked beneath. A threshold, a prank, a charm, someone hiding leftovers from a picky eater. No one knows, but the takeaway is food stuck around in one form or another, and it sometimes turned up in the oddest places. You wander into a granary next, cool, dark, and filled with the musty scent of barley and straw. A young girl scoops last week's grain from bin and blows the chaff off with practice puff. Some of it's gone buggy, but the hens will love it. Other bits might be roasted and added to beer mix. Waste not. The Egyptians even had word for this food logic. Ket meaning thing or stuff. Everything was ket, and every ket had use. Even if it was a little past its prime. Teenage boy out back is chopping onions. Probably not for the first time today. His fingers are stained. The last one chunk of last night's stew hits the courtyard floor. The dog dives for. Another mystery solved. The ancient Egyptians had a version of the 5-second rule, except theirs involved dogs, cats, goats, and possibly divine judgment. The sun hangs high, bellies are full, the village slips into a nap-like hush. You find yourself under a fig tree, listening to the sound of wind moving through papyrus reeds. Someone's weaving baskets. Baby babbles. Somewhere someone is definitely reboiling beans. And you, dear time traveler, are beginning. Realize that even 4,000 years ago, humanity had cracked the secret to leftovers. If it still smells okay, put it in pot. If it doesn't, feed it to someone else, preferably with feathers. You wake from your nap beneath the fig tree with a sticky leaf plastered to your cheek and the unmistakable scent of pickled radish. Maybe it's just the neighbor's foot wraps drying in the sun. Either way, you follow your nose toward small courtyard kitchen where the magic of ancient leftovers has truly begun to shine. This household, slightly better off than the ones you've seen, has knack for preservation. You notice large ceramic jars half buried in the sand for coolness, their mouths sealed with linen and sticky beeswax. A woman with arms like a champion grain pounder is peeling back the lid to reveal what you can only describe as ancient fridge contents. There are pickled cucumbers still floating serenely in brine, onions curled up like sleeping beetles, and even few preserved dates that gleam with syrupy smugness. Pickling was cornerstone of leftover culture in Egypt. Vinegar, salt, sun, all tools in the fight against spoilage, and sometimes spoilage itself was the point. Fermentation wasn't fully understood, but the results were beloved. Garlicky turnips left in the sun for days, fish paste aged into a near weaponized condiment. If it puckered your mouth and made your eyes water, it was probably delicacy. Historians still argue whether these fermentation techniques came from experimentation or accident. One theory suggests clay vessels buried too close to the Nile would swell and heat, kickstarting the microbial party. Another says people just liked the taste of things that stung the nose a little. Either way, you're now holding a piece of flatbread slathered with what may be the world's first proto-hummus. Yesterday's fava beans mashed with garlic and lemon juice aged overnight to deepen the flavor. Across the courtyard, group of women are cleaning fish, not fresh fish. No. These are leathery, dried things pulled from rooftop rack. They're soaked in vinegar and herbs to soften, then diced and added to pot of yesterday's stew, which has now entered its life. What began as lentil base, then became stew, is now sauce. By tomorrow, it might be soup again or filling for a barley pie. You're witnessing food reincarnation at its finest. Even animal bones had their second acts. Boiled for hours, sometimes even burned to charcoal and mixed into medicinal paste. In fact, charred bread crusts from last week's banquet, powdered and used for treating indigestion. You squint at tray of these crunchy rejects drying in the sun and try not to think of them as ancient Pepto-Bismol. Let's move a little deeper. Into the temples. Priests, despite their lofty status, were perhaps the busiest food recyclers of all. Offerings made to gods. Platters of roasted meat, baskets of bread, honey cakes, and fruit were rarely consumed by the divine, though who's to say? Instead, these items were carefully rotated out after ritual hours and redistributed among the temple staff. This divine regifting system ensured even the priest's assistants had leftovers. Sacred leftovers, no less. What was offered to Osiris at dawn might become priest's midday sandwich. Clay tablet unearthed in Karnak even shows detailed logs of food rotation from the offering tables. One entry notes, date cakes, unsullied, 2 days old, acceptable. Another a bit more questionable. Money and rings, oily, offered then returned, feed to livestock. You're beginning to notice pattern. Nothing just gets thrown away. Food is part of sacred economy. Whether you're farmer, fisherwoman, or high priest of Horus, you treat what's edible like it matters, as it does. By the time the sun starts its slow descent again, the day's meals are wrapping up. The last bits of bread are swept from the floor and gathered in basket. Leftover stew. Version 3 is poured into sealed pot, and young boy walks around with platter offering up slices of dried fig to the neighbors. Probably peace offering for borrowing someone's goat earlier. You sit with an elder under shaded awning. He's chewing something that looks suspiciously like fermented turnip, but might also be medicine. He gestures vaguely toward the setting sun and mutters about food being like water, always moving. It sounds profound, but also do you think he just doesn't want to throw away his turnip? This evening deepens. The jars are sealed again. The oven's cooled. The air smells of baked grain, oil, and smoke. It's peaceful, calm. You get the sense that life in ancient Egypt wasn't always easy, but it was clever, and clever people make clever leftovers. Night falls gently over the village, like someone pulling a linen curtain across the sky. The stars blink awake, and a fresh coolness settles in, curling around the ankles like a friendly cat. But before anyone drifts off to sleep, there's still one more thing to do. Clean up the remains of the day, because even under blanketed darkness, the ancient Egyptians never stopped thinking about food and what to do with what was left. You follow the quiet shuffle sandals toward the communal oven. It's not exactly buzzing, but there's a small group, mostly older women, tending to the final batch of slow-baking barley cakes. These aren't fresh meals, mind you. These are the leftovers of leftovers. Porridge that started to ferment, crust scraped from pots, flour swept from the floor. All rolled together with honey, maybe a little fig mesh, then flattened into patties and tucked among the embers. They're called Nefer cakes in some records. Literally, good cakes, though, whether that's hopeful marketing or genuine description is still debated. What's not debated is their purpose. These were the edible equivalents of the week's last joke. Not pretty, not fresh, but comforting in their persistence. If you nibble one, it's chewy, earthy, little smoky. You immediately want another. Leftovers in this context don't mean lower class. They mean practicality, skill. You notice one woman pressing stale bread into paste with dates and oil, shaping it into small palm-sized rounds. Tomorrow, those will be set on flat stones to dry and become rations. Dense, durable, and weirdly addictive. Soldiers carried them. Merchants packed them. Children probably used them as currency in complex sibling negotiations. But not everything got eaten again. Some scraps, especially the most pitiful ones, went to the compost heap. It's less pile than a tucked away corner behind goat shed. Here, rotting onions mingle with broken fig skins, and last week's fish bones glow faintly in the moonlight. Even these discards had value eventually. Mixed with Nile silt, they fed garden plots growing more lentils, more onions, more fish bait. You peek over wall and see someone pouring water onto a patch of green, whispering quiet thanks, not prayer, not ritual, just gratitude for food past and future. Now let's talk trash, or rather the lack of it. Unlike modern households with their neat bins and city collections, ancient Egyptians kept waste shockingly low. Excavations reveal that ancient village dumps were more bone charred and broken tool than food waste. It's not that they were spotless, it's that edible waste just didn't make it to the dump. It was too useful, and frankly, they couldn't afford to be wasteful. Historians still argue about the exact mechanics of waste disposal. Was there a formal composting system? Did pigs and dogs act as roaming cleanup crews? Some suggest the Nile itself took on a sacred waste role. Certain scraps, especially from temple offerings, were ceremonially returned to the river, a liquid loop of divine digestion. You climb onto low rooftop now, joining young man spreading thin sheets of dried bread dough out to catch the last heat of the clay tiles. He's trying to salvage what was left from failed baking experiment. Too wet, too sour, but still salvageable. Tomorrow he'll fry sheets and call him something new. Maybe he'll impress girl with them. Maybe he'll feed them to his grandmother and tell her it was intentional. You admire the audacity. One quirky tradition you stumble across involves kitchen gods, small household deities thought to watch over cooking and food. Some figurines found in excavation sites show ambush-looking characters with exaggerated bellies and grins. Offerings were made to these figures, especially when food spoiled unexpectedly. Burnt stew might be blamed on grumpy kitchen spirit, and the next batch would include tiny sacrifice of better ingredients as apology. Whether or not the gods accepted this peace offering remains divine mystery. Just below a soft clatter, you glance down and spot a child sneaking a piece of half-eaten fruit from a jar. Her mother doesn't scold. She just winks. It's late night snacking world without refrigeration, where sweetness is rare and fleeting. You chew your own imaginary bite, and it's somehow the most comforting taste of the day. Now far off, the temples begin to settle. Torches dim. Priests finish recording the day's offerings in long scrolls. Bread on those offering tables, collected carefully, trimmed of mold, and stored in sealed baskets for morning meals. And those sacred meats too sun-drenched to eat, rendered down into fats and used for lighting or ointments. Its strangely elegant system. Waste not, worship more. Back in the home you started from, mother checks on her clay pot of stew. Version 4, now barely stew, more paste than anything. She stirs it gently, adds sprig of mint, and sets it aside. Tomorrow it will be breakfast again. You lie back on the rooftop, watching the stars blink like lazy fireflies. Somewhere below, someone is yesterday's bread to tomorrow's chicken. Somewhere else, a cat is licking a bowl clean, and you, suspended in time and breadcrumbs, understand something ancient Egyptians knew deep in their bones. Leftovers aren't leftovers. They're the beginning of the next meal. You're up before the sun this time. Congratulations, you're now operating on ancient Egyptian peasant hours. The sky is still dark, that heavy blue-gray just before first light, and the air is thick with anticipation, not drama. Just breakfast, which for most Egyptians isn't much more than warmed over dinner, or better yet, creative remix. Down in the kitchen courtyard, the family is already shuffling into their daily rhythm. Clay pots are gently stirred. Flatbread is reheated on hot stones. That stew from last night, the one that topos, that's changed identities more times than a soap opera villain, is now thin with goat milk and served as porridge-like bowl of warmth. You take sip. It's surprisingly good, little funky, but good. Children are handed crusts from the previous day's loaves, dipped in date syrup if they're lucky. One child gnaws on wedge of dried fish like it's fruit roll-up. Another has what looks like mashed lentils smeared on barley biscuit. What pause? You're not sure who's winning. Everyone seems content. Breakfast was a curious time in ancient Egypt. Less about feasting and more about fortification. You didn't gorge, you fueled, and you didn't start fresh. You started from what was already there. Even pharaohs weren't exempt. Temple records suggest royal kitchens did prepare fresh food daily, but also, get this, rotated untouched delicacies from yesterday's feast into the next meal. Because even divine rulers weren't above good second-day goose pie. You shuffle toward the back of the courtyard where two young boys are playing with what looks like yesterday's melon rinds. They've carved them into little boats and are racing them in shallow ditch. One melon boat capsizes. The other is attacked by stray chicken. You briefly wonder if this is what historians mean by multifunctional domestic items. Over in shaded nook, an older woman is pounding herbs. Not for meal this time. For remedy, the leftover garlic skins and onion ends have been dried and mixed with vinegar into thick paste. She adds crushed barley and pinch of something brownish green. Possibly done. You decide not to ask. Good for the stomach, she says, as if reading your thoughts. Also good for bad spirits. She pats the side of the jar affectionately, very strong. Her granddaughter approaches with tiny bowl of yesterday's pomegranate seeds, now mashed into juice so sour it makes your teeth itch. She hands you sip. It's refreshing. Medicinal even. You try not to grimace. The old woman winks. Historians still argue whether medicinal leftovers like these were part of formal practice or just folk wisdom passed down like gossip. Some scrolls suggest temple doctors prescribed complex paste made from everything from burnt bread to beer sediment. Others hint at more trial and error approaches, like try this fisheye poultice and see if your headache goes away. In any case, the boundary between food and medicine was thinner than a sheet of pillow. If it came from the earth, grew under raw sun, or once clucked, slithered, or swam, it could be eaten, repurposed, preserved, or prescribed. You move back toward the kitchen where a small jar of something dark and shiny is being opened with care. It's old honey. Very possibly from a year ago. Still fragrant, still edible. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in tombs that's still technically safe to eat. You sample fingertip. Sweet, spicy, time traveling. This honey is being drizzled over what might be the day's crown jewel, round barley cake made from yesterday's leftover porridge, reshaped and baked to crispy perfection. It's not dessert. It's not breakfast. It's beautiful, beige in between, and it tastes like contentment. Small girl is trying to barter hers. For her brother's honey-crusted crust, negotiations are heated but respectful. You hear terms like 3 beetles and 1 shiny rock. Eventually, trade is struck. Civilization, you think, is safe for another day. Let's not forget the animals. The goats get the tough parts of yesterday's greens. The chickens are pecking through old grain husks and bug-riddled fruit. Even the cat gets in on the action, licking bowl once filled with stewed meat, not just fragrant memory. Nothing goes to waste, not even among the non-human members of the household. And then comes the most important part of the morning, storage. With practiced hands, the mother scrapes what's left of breakfast into small pots. Clay lids are secured with strips of cloth and sealed with dab of mud. Each vessel is labeled with symbol scratched in with twig. Maybe it means lentils. Maybe it means do not touch mine. Either way, it's effective. You help her carry the jars to the cool cellar pit beneath the house. It's not fridge, but it stays remarkably chill. Down here, jars of pickled garlic and fermented beans sleep side by side like old friends. You swear at one of them gives you a knowing nod. You pause before climbing back up. The silence of the cellar is thick, almost sacred. This is the treasure vault. Really, this is where survival lives. Back in the sun, breakfast is over. Plates are cleaned. The day's work begins. But even now, someone is already thinking about dinner and how this morning's crust might become tonight's dumpling, because that's the rhythm of it all, the loop, the everlasting buffet. In ancient leftovers weren't just necessity, they were philosophy. By now, you're probably catching on. Ancient Egyptians were the original remix masters of cuisine, and tonight your tour of edible second lives continues with deep dive into the world of sauces, broths, and other clever cover-ups. It begins in pot that's seen better days. Cracked around the rim, darkened at the base, but it's still going strong. Kind of like retiree on their third cruise. Inside, the remnants of lentil stew bubble lazily, thickened with the stuff of old barley and suspicious but satisfying glug of leftover beer. You lean in. It smells oddly comforting. Like someone else he possessed childhood. Near the hearth, the cook tosses in a chopped onion, some leeks past their prime, and something brown and meaty that may have once been fish. Or very confident mushroom. The goal isn't freshness, it's depth, layers. This isn't just dinner. It's cumulative record of the week's menu, like culinary papyrus scroll, but wetter. This, friend, is how ancient Egyptian master sauces were born. Less recipe, more vibe. Households kept perpetual stew going day after day, feeding it scraps and sipping from it like sacred broth. There's even archaeological debate about whether certain households or temples maintained communal pots that were never fully emptied, just replenished and reheated, sort of like sourdough starter, but soupier and more forgiving. And it wasn't just about flavor. Egyptians believed in harmony between the senses and the spirit. Eating something that had matured over days was said to be good for grounding the soul, or at the very least for warming your toes. You crouch next to the bubbling pot and note a small dish nearby holding crushed coriander, fenugreek, and mint. A child barely old enough to hold the pestle dutifully grinds the herbs under the gaze of her grandmother. The aroma is intoxicating. It's meant to lift the stew, not just flavor-wise, but spiritually. In land where every action could echo into the afterlife, even sauce needed to maintain its cosmic vibe. Oh, and let's talk about the beer. You knew we'd come back to it. Remember the flat beer dregs from yesterday? Guess what? They're not going to waste. No, they're headed straight into the cooking pot. Ancient Egyptians considered beer both drink and cooking medium, like a kind of wheat-based potion that doubled as broth, brine, and bread sucker. It makes sense when you think about it. Beer was everywhere, consumed daily by all classes, from builders to priests to, yes, children. It was mildly alcoholic and packed with nutrients, kind of like a gritty smoothie. And when it got stale, it went straight into the pot, reviving grains, loosening stews, and turning dry meat into something approaching tender. Sort of, there's theory. Still debated. That certain ceremonial feasts involved dishes marinated entirely in leftover beer and honey. If so, you're now eating what might have been reserved for nobility, albeit few thousand years late and somewhat lukewarm. Still, you savor the tang. It lingers, complex and oddly yeasty, like the inside of warm bakery. And what about meat scraps? The real treasures. Bones with bit of chew still on them, fatty trimmings from yesterday's goose, or even dried chunks from that jerky experiment someone tried last week. Nothing is thrown away. It all goes into the recombination pot, as modern archaeologists so charmingly call it. Today, the cook is feeling ambitious. She adds diced dates and crushed nuts to the stew, not because the recipe calls for it, but because the pantry had leftovers from an offering tray earlier that morning. The gods got the fresh stuff. You get the seconds, and honestly, you're not mad about it. There's also paste being prepared nearby, dark and glossy, made from mashed garlic, sesame, and fermented fish. Think of it as ancient ketchup if ketchup could punch you in the nose and make you like it. It's meant for slathering over flatbread or dipping bits of leftover meat or simply licking off your fingers when no one's looking, which you do just once for research. Stray cat eyes you from under the bench. She, too, is an expert in leftovers. You slip her bit of yesterday's pigeon thigh. She blinks slowly, regal and unimpressed. You've passed the test. Now let's talk vessels. Clay jars with tightly packed lids lined with old olive paste are used concentrated sauces. Some of these sauces ferment over weeks, getting tangier, saltier, and more spirited. Some were used to flavor whole meals with just a spoonful. Others were kept for medical or ritual purposes. One inscription suggests a fermented leek sauce was used to banish evil wind from the stomach. We'll let you interpret that however you like. There's something poetic about this whole approach to food. It's cyclical, mindful. You don't toss things away just because they've changed. You reintroduce them, enhance them, give them second life. Bit like reincarnation, but tastier. And speaking of which, the cook now adds a handful of crumbled bread from 3 days ago to thicken the bubbling mix. She stirs, hums a song about Ra's morning chariot, and gestures for you to try spoonful. It's not pretty, it's not Instagram worthy, but it's deep, comforting, and somehow familiar, like bedtime story you only half remember but still love. It's the taste of people who understood patience, who knew that the best things didn't always come fresh, but came again, wiser, richer, and slightly fermented. You awaken, not from sleep, but from the trance of broth and breadcrumbs, with soft clatter of pottery near your left ear. The morning sun is breaking through the lattice window, filtering into the modest kitchen you've practically moved into by now. And as the caboose, this apprentice rolls in large basket of yesterday's banquet remains, you realize today you're helping feed the animals, because in ancient Egypt, nothing, absolutely nothing, was allowed to truly go to waste, not if goat could chew it or sacred ibis could peck at it. Or, in one odd case, if a crocodile in the temple pond could be gently encouraged to swallow it whole, he followed the apprentice through a rear door into the animal yard. This isn't just some muddy pen with chickens. No, this is more like courtyard at edible redistribution, where the line between scrap and supper gets cheerfully blurred. The geese get the barley mash, still soaked in sweet beer. Their squawking approval fills the air, oddly dignified. The goats, the opportunists, munch on turnip greens and withered papyrus roots. And the pigs, well, if pigs had yelped, this slop would have 5 stars in gold ink, but it's not just domestic animals that benefit. In temple compounds and noble estates, sacred animals, ibises, baboons, cats, even falcons, were fed with carefully curated leftovers. Fish heads, honey cakes too stale for human teeth, bits of dried figs, even fragments of ritual offerings once laid before Osiris himself. Once God sniffed it, apparently it was fair game for his favorite bird. Historians still argue whether certain animals were deliberately overfed to enhance their sacredness, or whether we're just seeing the world's earliest cases of temple-induced pet obesity. Either way, the animals seem blissfully unaware, the cats especially reclining like queens, accepting morsels from the hands of priests. One priest even keeps journal, scratched into stone fragments, complaining that the sacred mongoose refuses to eat old lentils. Eva behavior, even back then, your handed wooden tray holding assorted scraps, half-roasted beet wedge of honey bread, and something that might once have been your task. Feed it to the temple crocodile. Yes, the crocodile you tread carefully toward. A small walled pond behind the granary, the air smells of algae, wet stone, and the distinct tang of ancient ambition. The crocodile, named Happy, of course, lolls in the shallows like log that dreamed of teeth. You toss the food gently. Happy opens one eye. He considers, and with surprising grace, he glides over and snaps up your offering with lazy flick of jaw, is oddly polite about it, as if to say, "Thanks, peasant." Al Leaf, some temples kept entire flocks of sacred birds or colonies of cats, all fed partly by leftovers from festivals in temple kitchens. These weren't pets, they were embodiments of divine forces, and their diets, while cobbled together, were taken seriously. One inscription inside chapel details rotating menu for sacred baboon, including stewed prunes, baked lentils, and the occasional goat rib. Historians can't decide whether the was revered or simply spoiled. Back in the village, farmers also reused scraps to feed their animals, especially during lean seasons. Urusapos, a waste of overripe fruit, even ground bones and shell fragments, rich in minerals, were all fed to pigs, dogs, and chickens. And if something wasn't quite fit for animals, well, then it probably became compost, or as the Egyptians called it, black earth booster. Okay, that's not real translation, but you get the idea. This repurposing was not just practical, it was spiritual. In Egyptian cosmology, decay wasn't the end, it was transition. Just this soul journey to the afterlife, so too did leftover fig seed into the belly of bird or the belly of the earth. Either way, it continued its purpose. And so each morning, the redistribution of yesterday's table becomes ceremony of sorts. The cook whispers blessing over the bones before handing them to the herdsman. The children chase hens with bread crusts, squealing with glee. Even the beetle that scuttles across the stone floor, dragging shriveled grape, becomes part of the sleepy dance of reuse. In one charming household mural, dog is depicted licking stew bowl clean. Beneath caption that translates loosely to, "Let no good thing go to Duat being the realm of the dead." It's joke, of course, but very Egyptian one. You watch now as the apprentice empties ceramic pot onto shaded patch of earth. It's yesterday's grain porridge mixed with vegetable peelings. Within minutes, birds descend like tiny feathered scavengers, pecking and chirping with purpose. Even the insects join the feast. It's less gross than you'd think. Somehow it feels and as the cook wipes her hands and mutters about the neighbors, lazy ducks, you realize there's kind of grace in this system. Logic to letting nothing, neither food nor effort nor blessing, go to waste. You lean against the sun-warmed wall, listening to the flutter of wings, the snort of the donkey, and the faint plop of a satisfied crocodile. The day rolls on. The cycle continues. The leftovers live again. You're roused from your crocodilian reverie by the scent of something both sour and spicy drifting in from the street. An open jar of pickled radishes, perhaps, or maybe passing merchant's cart lined with garlic and cumin. Whatever it is, it calls you into the marketplace. Because today, Wapals, are you going to learn the fine and surprisingly sophisticated art of selling, or more often reselling, yesterday's food. Welcome to the bustling street economy of ancient Egypt, where leftovers found new life at the hands of clever vendors with time-hardened palms and sharp tongues. The morning sun is still climbing, and already the lanes pulse with chatter and motion. Not the grand avenue by the temple gates, but the narrow side alleys. The ones lined with wooden carts, ragged canopies, and the glorious scent of reheated stew. And let's be honest, you're a little hungry again, no shame. That morning crocodile episode built up an appetite. The woman with the faded red headscarf. She's been refrying mashed lentil cakes since dawn, shaping them into smaller patties and selling them with dab of fermented date paste. Technically, it's street food. Spiritually, it's comfort food. And depending on who you ask, it might be Egypt's original fast casual dining experience. Just down the road, Man Hawk's stewed goat bits. That's not the official name, of course. He calls it Nedjurhuri or blessed broth, which is stretched considering made from what's left in temple cauldrons after feast days. But that's the genius. Flavors concentrated overnight, thickened by time and heat, then topped with fresh herbs to distract from their sketchy origins. You sample spoonful. It oppose. Thus, weirdly delicious. Historians still argue whether these vendors were licensed professionals or informal part-timers. Former cooks, widows, or retired servants making few extra deben. Some scholars insist the state regulated food stalls closely, especially in big cities like Memphis or Thebes. Others say it was more free-for-all. Either way, the result is the same recycled smorgasbord, open from sunrise to the last drumbeat of the market guards. One of the most popular stalls is run by an elderly couple who specialize in yesterday's porridge reborn. Their trick: add honey, cinnamon, and crushed lotus seeds, press it into triangles, and serve chilled on sycamore leaves. A line forms early. Children, dock workers, even priests in casual linen tunics, trying not to be seen. This isn't just meal, it's taste of childhood, lullaby for the stomach. As you wander, you pass by vendor muttering blessings over trays of dried fish tails. They were smoked 2 days ago, then soaked overnight in spiced vinegar to mask the fact that they've been, let's say, around the block. You catch whiff and immediately understand why she's praying. Some carts are more aspirational. One young man with wide-brimmed reed hat claims to offer divine leftovers touched by Hathor herself. In truth, it's slightly burnt barley bread with smear of sheep cheese. But he's charming, and the cheese is salty, sour, and just wait, you buy one. And then there are the fusion dishes. Yes, even back then. A Libyan-born vendor fries leftover chickpea stew with onions and sells it in triangular pastry shells, claiming it's the snack of desert princes. Next door, a Nubian woman mixes fermented millet scraps with pickled garlic and dried river greens into something that tastes sharp, odd, but strangely addictive. She laughs when you cough and hands you sweet beer to wash it down. There's something comforting in this chaos of half meals and warmed over blessings. Everyone knows what's really going on. No one pretends this is the freshest food in town. But it's warm, it's seasoned, and it tells story in every bite. Story of last night's feast, this morning's hustle, and tomorrow's lunch. 'Cause even leftovers can have lineage. You pause beside an old man sitting behind tiny stand selling what he calls memory crumbs. It's just bits of dried bread soaked in pomegranate juice and served in little clay cup. But the name sticks with you. He says everything tastes better when you give it name, especially when secondhand. Historians love debating whether ancient Egyptians had formal words for leftovers. Some argue there were coded phrases. Things like Nesu Henu, king's remainder, for royal scraps, or Saink, to make live again, for reused temple offerings. Others think it was all just context, tone of voice, and which way the cook raised her eyebrow, and yet the practice was so common, so deeply embedded that it didn't oppose. A teeny special word. Reuse was survival. It was ritual, it was economy, ecology, and hospitality rolled into one. By now you've got belly full, twice fried lentils and pomegranate bread pudding, and the sun is high over the city. The market begins to thin. Vendors pack away the less elbow bits for pig feet or compost heaps. Some scrape out cauldrons and prepare to start again. Today's stew destined to become tomorrow's special. You linger a moment longer, watching child barter for skewer of leftover duck liver. His price for reciting and offering him in perfect tone. His mother claps. The vendor bows. And just like that, forgotten bit of yesterday becomes gift. And you wander off a little fuller, a little wiser, and now completely convinced that in Egypt, even the scraps have style. As the market noise fades behind you, your path winds toward the temples. Grand sun-bleached sanctuaries with painted colonnades and courtyards filled with the scented incense and hot stone. But today you're not here to admire the murals or bow before the gods. You've got leftovers on the brain, and rumor has it the temple kitchens, ancient Egypt's quiet epicenter of culinary repurposing. Not all divine offerings, you see, went straight from altar to afterlife. In fact, most did. The gods were believed to consume the essence of the food. The divine spirit of the roast goose or the sacred sweetness of honey cake, what remained, well, that was still perfectly edible, blessed even, which meant someone had to decide what to do with it all, and that someone might just be you standing ankle deep in onion skins behind the temple's back door. The temple complex is labyrinth, massive storage rooms filled with sacks of grain, crates of dried figs, amphorae of beer and wine, much of it collected from citizens in the form of offerings or temple taxes. On feast days, the kitchens swell with activity. Whole oxen are roasted, ducks are stuffed with garlic and wild herbs. Breads are baked in divine shapes, as of Horus solar discs, the occasional symbolic crocodile for dramatic flair. But after the priests chant, the incense curls, and the offerings are made, those meals don't disappear. They're carted back into the depths of the temple where the real sorting begins. Imagine an assembly line, but instead of widgets or circuit boards, it's smoked fish, honey-glazed locusts, and pyramid-shaped date loaves. And it's here you meet the promessa, the house of birth. But today it abodes. That's more like the house of leftovers. Priests and kitchen staff sort food by freshness, ritual category, and let's call it divine residual glow. High-grade meats might go to senior priests. Slightly singed goose legs go to scribes. Smushed fig cake? That might feed the resident temple cats. Historians still argue whether these redistributions were formalized into kind of spiritual rationing system or if it was more like divine free-for-all, first come first served with side of bureaucratic elbowing. Some temple records hint at specific hierarchies. One thigh of oxen to the lector priest, one cup of beer to the temple porter. Others are vague and poetic, noting only that the god receives and the people rejoice. There are stories of low-ranking staff slipping sacred breads into their satchels for their children, of scribes sneaking honey pigeon bits under their robes, of overcooked lentils making their way to the temple gardeners. After all, even holy hedges need tending, and yet no one seems offended by the celestial hand-me-down system. In fact, it's deeply tied to the Egyptian concept of mat. Balance, order, the harmony of the universe. To waste was to disrupt that balance, so reusing divine offerings wasn't just practical, it was cosmic bookkeeping. Still, the practice wasn't without its quirks. Some foods, like raw fish or unfinished beer, were considered too volatile to pass along. They were returned to the Nile, ceremonially poured or floated away with soft hymns. Think of it, riverine compost bin with spiritual panache. Other items were burned, not out of disrespect, but as final gesture of transformation. Like the Nile had a role to play in cleansing the leftovers of their earthly dregs. You watch one such ritual from the shadows as an acolyte tosses scorched honey cakes into a brazier, muttering a sleepy prayer to rot. The smell is both delicious and tragic. But not everything is so solemn. In the back courtyards, the atmosphere shifts. Your temple cooks are already planning tonight's staff meal. Kind of ancient potluck made from ceremonial scraps. Adds chopped onions to yesterday's roast goat. Another crushes leftover lentils into patties and fries them in sesame oil. You get handed a bowl of it all with a wink and a don't tell the high priest. You sit beneath fig tree, eating meal that was technically made for God, warmed by coals that once burned in sacred brazier. There's something humbling about it, reverent, a little weird, but undeniably tasty. And then there are the scrolls, thick with grease stains and faded ink, tucked into the temple library. Some describe food allotments, others read like recipes for leftovers. One particularly cheeky note reads, "Do not reheat the barley mash third time, lest it offend the goddess Hathor." Beauly noted, it's here that you realize ancient Egypt wasn't just place of grand pyramids and golden masks. It was place where even spoonful of reheated beans could be part of ritual, where gods were honored through roast duck and beer, and the people were nourished by what was left behind. Sacred cycle of flavor and function. As the temple bells chime the end of the workday, you watch the kitchen staff rinse clay pots, scrape grill stones, and parcel out the final bits of goose fat and lentil mash. The cats once again line up at the back door. Order is restored. Matt is pleased, and you brush few breadcrumbs from your robe, thank your host with sleepy nod, and begin your stroll back toward the city, stomach full of divine leftovers, and the quiet understanding that even in the holiest of places, good meal never goes to waste. By now, the midday sun slants low across the Nile, casting golden ripples over fishing boats and sleepy hippos. You've walked off your holy lentils mostly, and your path turns back toward the city's residential quarters, simple mud brick homes with cool courtyards, buzzing with the life of families, pets, and flies, lots of flies. But also some of the most quietly ingenious recycling you've seen yet, because when it comes to leftovers, it's not just eat, it's what you do with what you don't eat. You duck into a shaded alley where a child is poking at what appears to be a tiny pile of porridge dried into concrete. It's yesterday's breakfast spread out on flat rock. At first you think she's making food art, but her older brother strolls over and starts scraping the hardened mass into jar. This is not trash. This is fuel. In households without constant access to firewood or dung cakes, dried leftover starches, porridge, bread, heels, old fat, beans can be collected, dried, and burned. Not as efficient as a proper log, but in the cramped kitchen of a laborer's home. Good enough to heat pot of beer soup. Historians still argue whether this technique was widespread or regional adaptation, but archaeological digs have turned up jars of crumbled, blackened starch, too burned to be edible, too carefully stored to be trash. Some even had bits of crushed bone or fish scales mixed in, possibly for added burn value or maybe just poor sorting. Either way, someone figured out how to turn dinner dregs into breakfast flames. Next door, a mother is patting leftover mashed lentils into rough, dry cakes. You brace for another deep-fried snack, but no, these are mouse traps. The strong scent draws rodents who get stuck in the paste, much to the delight of her youngest son, who gleefully checks the traps each morning like it's his birthday. You nod respectfully. Leftovers is both sustenance and pest control. That's multitasking. In another home, you spot low shelf with several tightly sealed jars labeled with faint hieratic scribbles. Inside, preserved scraps, fruit skins, herbs, stems, the odd strip of dried goat, used for tinctures and ointments. This family has a grandmother who used to be a temple healer, and she treats everything from cuts to flatulence with homemade remedies steeped in the detritus of yesterday's meals. Your guide neighborhood boy with sandals too big for his feet and an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone's business points out an old man lounging in hammock. He eats old pickles to make his joints hurt less. You raise an eyebrow on purpose. The boy nods and says it resets his humors. Smells terrible, though. The boy leads you farther down the block, where a group of women are mashing leftover figs and fish into pulpy paste and smearing it across woven reed mats. They're not making food, they're preparing bait for fly traps. Once dried, the mats are hung from ceilings or doors. Flies swarm them, stick to the tacky sweetness, and die with full bellies. One woman mutters that the gods love all creatures, even the annoying ones, and then smacks mosquito with elbow. As you keep walking, you pass a courtyard where two elderly men are sitting beneath a pomegranate tree, sipping from shared mugs of a dark, viscous brew. It smells faintly of molasses and something sour at your offered sip. It's fermented stew water, fortified with leftover dates and sprinkled barley malt, not quite beer, not quite broth, but definitely potent. The men claim it helps with dreams. You're not sure if that's a good thing. Further on, you find a humble workshop where two young girls are grinding old bread into powder, sifting it carefully and mixing it with egg whites and mud. They're making sort of plaster. Used to seal cracks in walls or patch sandals. One of the girls winks and says her family once patched boat with it. Still floats, she whispers proudly. Historians remain divided on whether these practices were ritual necessity or both. Some argue the Egyptians hated waste. Others point to religious texts that speak of binding the life of the day to the tasks of the next, a poetic way to justify using yesterday's stew water to mop the floor. And then, of course, there's the compost pit. Every few homes you'll see one. Just little ditch lined with potsherds and straw where food scraps mingle with ashes and dirt. In wealthier homes, the compost might feed rooftop garden. In simpler homes, it becomes a way to grow herbs, onions, maybe even the occasional melon. One family has trained their goat to eat directly from the pile. The goat looks smug. You find yourself marveling not just at the practicality, but the intentionality of it all. Nothing here is done thoughtlessly. Each crust, each peel, each bone has a purpose beyond the plate. It's like every household is quietly engaged in its own form of culinary alchemy. Even the neighborhood cats get in on the action. You pass corner where someone set out low bowl of fish skin broth, thin, salty, left over from an earlier meal. The cats slurp it with an enthusiasm usually reserved for divine offerings. And so, as the afternoon gives way to evening and the neighborhood settles into the soft clatter of evening chores, you begin to understand just how deeply leftovers were embedded into Egyptian life. They were fire, they were medicine, they were pest control, fly bait, wall patch, and dream fuel. You smile as the wind picks up, carrying the faint scent of drying porridge and crushed herbs. It's not glamorous, it's not golden or gilded, but it's endlessly inventive. Somehow it makes the ancient world feel closer, more familiar. Because honestly, who among us hasn't repurposed old rice into fried rice or worn yesterday's socks as today's emergency mittens? You return to your borrowed cot under fig tree and stretch your legs. Tomorrow's stew may just begin tonight. Evening has settled over the Nalak, the silken veil. You feel the shift in air. Cooler, quieter, edged with the distant of reed flutes and the soft shuffle of sandals against packed earth. The city slows, but it doesn't sleep. Not yet. There's still food to tend, leftovers to reckon with, and rituals to perform. Your feet guide you toward one of the lesser temples, not the grand limestone behemoths of kings and gods, but modest shrine tucked between workshops. Houses, here the sacred and the domestic blur in the most peculiar of ways. Because in ancient Egypt, even the gods had leftovers. A priest with an elaborate leopard skin sash welcomes you in. He's balancing large, shallow bowl, its contents steaming faintly in the flickering torchlight. Leftover temple offerings. Mostly bread, sometimes beer, occasionally dried meats or onions. These are not discarded. They are redistributed. The gods you see never eat their meals in the physical sense. Their essence, their ka, absorbs the spirit. Nourishment leaving behind food that is spiritually hollow but still physically present. And here's where things get weirdly efficient. Once a god is finished with a sacred offering, that food is deemed safe and even blessed for human consumption. It's handed off to the temple workers, priests, or redistributed to the poor, essentially divine leftovers. Celestial seconds, you join the priest as he distributes small wedges of God bread to a line of quietly waiting widows and elderly men. The bread is dense, faintly sweet, and infused with sesame and dates. Good for the dreams, one murmurs, pressing peace to her forehead before tucking it away. Historians still debate whether this practice was driven more by practical charity or deep-seated belief. Was it about feeding the hungry or honoring the cyclical relationship between gods and mortals? Probably both. As with much in ancient Egypt, the lines between the sacred and the sensible tend to blur. Outside the temple, you spot a fire pit where a cluster of young novices are preparing what might be the ancient version of soup kitchens do. Into a massive pot go all the day's remnants, ends of leeks, half-scooped lentils, sour beer foam, crusts from ceremonial loaves. They're boiled down with a handful of herbs and maybe, just maybe, chicken bone or two. The smell isn't heavenly, but it's deeply comforting. Your handed bowl. It's oddly flavorful. Little salty, little smoky, like stories someone whispered into your spoon. But leftovers didn't only feed the hungry or the holy. They also served bureaucratic purposes. In temple records, scribes often kept track of offerings in obsessive detail. How many loaves? How many jars of beer? What time was it presented? Who reclaimed it afterward? Sometimes the leftovers themselves became tokens of loyalty or bribery. A favored artisan might receive yesterday's god beer as reward. Guard might be placated with few sacred onions. In one surviving scroll, scribe scrawled complaint that the gut horse's bread had already been nibbled by mice before redistribution. The mice apparently did not fear divine retribution. The gods might bless the bread, but they did not guard it from rodents. There's also the curious case of send offerings for aromatic herbs and resins to smolder for the gods. These two had second life. Ashes from burned frankincense were often swept up and repurposed as purifying powder in baths or mixed with oils to anoint the sick. Even the smoke from a divine snack had afterlives. As you wander back toward the temple's rear garden, you find small basins surrounded by flowering plants. Your temple workers dump the excess water from boiled offerings, infused with flavors and sacred intentions, into the soil. These plants, grown from leftovers of the gods, are believed to produce more potent blooms. One novice plucks pink lotus and tucks it behind your ear. It helps you remember your dreams, she says solemnly. You smile because at this point, dreams are as real as anything. Before you leave, priest tells you of one final oddity. In certain mystery cults, it was believed that eating divine leftovers allowed the soul to glimpse the afterlife. Not permanently, of course, but just peek, enough to feel the cool rush of the underworld or the warm embrace of Osiris's judgment hall. Whether this is myth, metaphor, marketing, well, historians still argue about that. You exit the shrine with your belly full of celestial crumbs, your mind spinning with images of incense, ash-face masks, and godly beer rations. It's not how you imagine sacred food, but in a way it makes sense. The gods give, the people receive, and nothing, absolutely nothing, goes to waste. The stars are brighter now, and the streets are nearly empty, save for the occasional cat or shadowy priest making final round. Somewhere behind the temple walls, pot is still bubbling. By now your feet know the rhythm of the streets. The sounds of the city have faded into a quiet lull. Soft hoots of distant owls, the muted clink of clay jars, the hush of sand being swept from courtyard. You drift toward the quarters of the embalmer's district, drawn not by morbid curiosity, but because, you guessed it, leftovers had place here too, but not in the way you might expect. The air is thicker here, scented with resin and natron, that mineral cocktail of drying salts used to adapt. You pass workshops where embalmers carefully pack organs into canopic jars, a craft that has been passed down like a family recipe, and oddly enough, it was kind of a recipe. Every embalmer had their own methods, preferred blends of herbs, resins, and spices for different ranks of the deceased. One such spice, leftover myrrh from temple offerings, divine discount embalming, if you will. You round a corner and pause before a storeroom. Inside are bundles wrapped in linen, scraps mostly, bits of old temple cloth, too ragged for ceremonies, but perfectly useful for wrapping bones or padding body cavity. One apprentice is stitching a torn edge with meticulous focus, muttering under his breath about how the gods don't care if it's new, just clean, which is reassuring, really. But leftovers weren't just part of the embalming process. They also went with the dead. You find yourself at small tomb mid-construction, and the stonemason invites you in. The walls are blank, waiting for pigments and stories. At the center, shallow pit for the body, and beside it, tall clay pot, empty. For now, that's for the leftover stew, the mason says casually, wiping sweat from his brow. His wife makes good barley bean mash. She wants him to have it in the afterlife. You nod solemnly, resisting the urge to ask whether the afterlife has fire pits or spoons. Across Egypt, tomb offerings often included humble remnants of daily meals. Last night's lentils, bit of flatbread, even date cakes too stale for the living. These weren't pity offerings. They were memory tokens. Food carried emotional weight. It tethered the soul to comfort and continuity. You might not be able to carry your house into the afterlife, but your favorite leftovers, those were coming with you. Historians still debate whether such offerings were ever refreshed, swapped out by grieving families over time. In some tombs, fresh bread loaves have been found years after burial, crumbling but unmistakably placed with care. Was it tradition, guilt, or just a good excuse to bake something? And then there's the fascinating role of the ka priest, the person hired to feed the dead regularly, once a week, sometimes more. These priests would deliver offerings to Tomb Chapel. Beer, bread, onions, sometimes meat, but often these offerings weren't newly prepared. They were yesterday's offerings from the temple redirected. You see where this is going. Yes, dead or alive, everyone got taste of leftovers. You drift farther into the necropolis and the silence becomes velvety. Cluster of tombs here have been repurposed as storehouses. Inside, you glimpse jars of dried fish, bundles of leeks, amphorae with faint traces of honeyed beer. Some are labeled with names, scribbled in faded red ink. For the overseer's mother, one reads, "For my beloved brother, may he not thirst." Oh. One corner holds broken, filled with powdered spices, not valuable enough to sell, but fragrant enough to sweeten memory. If one sleepy caretaker tells you the dead don't eat much, but they notice, there's even some evidence, fragmentary but tantalizing. That special tomb baked loaves were made entirely from leftovers. Flour swept from temple floors, mashed fruit pulp from wine pressing, even reused lard. Whether out of thrift, reverence, or simply tradition, these loaves became symbolic acts of devotion. You gave the dead what you had, even if it was scraps, especially was scraps. And remember those crocodile-done sunscreen pots from earlier? Well, some embalmers believed that the residue from such ointments had protective properties for the dead, too. It wasn't unusual for old jars, still faintly smeared with their pungent contents, to be tucked into burial bundles. Waste not, want not, even in eternity. The wind stirs through the palm fronds overhead. Jackal barks somewhere in the distance. You pass mural in progress, halfway painted on tomb wall. It shows men reclining beside banquet table, one hand holding goblet, the other reaching for what looks like roast goose. Line of hieroglyphs reads, "May his hunger never return." And maybe that's the heart of it all. In this world, the dead were not forgotten. They were hungry ghosts to be fed, comforted, and cared for. And leftovers, those humble, unassuming bits of daily life, became the glue between memory and eternity. So next time you pack away your half-finished dinner, just remember, in ancient Egypt, that might have been sacred, or at least spiritually recyclable. You leave the necropolis quietly, the sand warm under your toes, your thoughts full of stew pots, barley mesh, and the most eternal left imaginable. The stars are high now, steady and indifferent. The Nile glimmers faintly to the west, whining like sleeping serpent. You're back in the city proper, where the homes are quieter but still humming with subtle end-of-day energy. You pass through narrow lane, walls close, the air thick with the smell of last-minute cooking. Mix of garlic, roasting lentils, and something faintly sweet. And that's where you find them, the picklers. 3 women seated on low stools or elbow-deep in clay jars. One slicing radishes, another packs wild cucumbers into brine, and the third, an elder with single tooth, is stirring something mysterious in thick paste. Bold bread sauce, she mutters, not looking up. Takes 3 days. Ferments nicer if you insult it little. She then proceeds to curse the jar softly in ancient Egyptian. You're not entirely sure if she's joking, but welcome to the world of preserved leftovers. Culinary survival tactic and quiet art form all its own. In place where the sun ruled everything and food spoiled faster than you could blink, Egyptians became masters of keeping things just on the edge of edible. But rather than waste, they transform. Take old bread. Once too hard to chew, it could be soaked, spiced, mashed, and either dried into crisp rusks or fermented into a kind of sour condiment, something between mustard and despair. Historians are still unsure of the exact recipe. Some say it was mixed with garlic and fenugreek. Others believe it was left to rot in linen-lined pits where microbes and time did their work. In either case, it shows up often in the margins of estate inventories, listed as sour mash or pungent bread jelly. Sounds delicious, right? Well, let's just say your taste buds may need convincing. But the heart of the matter is ingenuity. Nothing was wasted, not even time. You move to another jar. This one holds preserved onions, swimming in a mixture of vinegar, beer dregs, and what might be honey or molasses. It's hard to tell in the dark. The woman smiles, hands you peace. For bad spirits, she says, gesturing vaguely, and bad breath. Fermented vegetables weren't just food. They were medicine, charms, even status symbols. Good pickling was passed down like family heirloom. The exact brine ratio, guarded secret. One ancient document even contains a half-riddle, half-recipe. Add salt like tears, vinegar like gossip, and time like mourning. So yes, Culinary cryptic crossword energy. And then there's the curious case of dried fish, not your standard market variety, but what scholars call reluctant fish, the ones too small, too mangled, or just too left over for the priests to accept as offerings. These were filleted or sometimes not, salted heavily, wrapped in palm fibers, and laid on rooftops to sun dry. After a few days, they could be ground into powder and used as seasoning or smeared on bread. Or in particularly daring households, eaten like jerky. Some communities even used dried fish paste as a kind of spiritual deterrent. Hung in small packets near doors, it was believed to repel the evil eye and keep gossipers at bay. Historians still argue whether this was superstition or a very niche kind of passive aggression, and you can't talk preservation without mentioning oil. Ancient Egyptians rendered fat from geese or cows, mixed it with herbs, and poured it over meat scraps to create kind of protocan fit. Buried in sealed pots, these could last for weeks, sometimes longer. One excavation even unearthed a sealed clay jar containing preserved duck from over 3,000 years ago. Still intact, still duck. Would you eat it? Probably not, but it's the thought that counts. In wealthier homes, leftovers were even sealed with wax, placed in cool niches carved into thick walls. Early fridges and way the layering of fat over food was nippos. A tea just practical, it was poetic. One love letter found on papyrus compares woman's beauty to a lamb sealed in goose fat, sweet, soft, and enduring. Make of that what you will. You pause at a shopfront where a man is pouring old lentil stew into thin trays. Sun cakes, he says. Once dried, these hard wafers could be broken up and boiled again into new stew, or eaten as is if you liked your snacks gritty and emotionally challenging. Preservation was as much social strategy as culinary one. Neighbors traded jars of pickled radish for fermented bean paste. Popular child might be invited to share the family's best preserved thread. You didn't just eat your leftovers. You cultivated them. Even the language reflects this. The word for kept or saved shares root with blessed in some contexts. To preserve food was to show reverence. Not just for the gods, but for life itself, for time, for the labor it took to grow a single onion. And so you sit for a while among the jars, the stones warm beneath you, the stars steady above. The women gossip in soft voices. One hums an old lullaby. Somewhere a cat knocks over a jar and is cursed gently. You lean back, the scent of vinegar and spice in your nose, and wonder, maybe this is what memory smells like. The rooftops are quiet now, except for the occasional shuffle of a cat or the creak of a reed mat in the breeze. You slip past sleeping homes, your steps soft, your thoughts beginning to blur. Still, there's one more place your feet insist on going. Small crooked alley behind the granaries. The air smells like barley, sweat, and something vaguely burnt. This is where to meet the repurposers. You catch them just finishing up. Small group of temple workers, not priests exactly, but caretakers. Sweepers, keepers of sacred odds and ends. One of them stirs pot that looks suspiciously like yesterday's porridge. Another is scraping wax from old offering candles, tossing the chunks into jar marked with barely visible scribble. Youthful, you're not sure if that means useful now or useful eventually, or maybe it oppose. That's just aspirational labeling. The repurposers specialize in the leftovers that no one else wants. Burnt bread from failed temple rituals, dried and crumbled for incense. Broken jars that once held honey dates, shards turned into small scoops for measuring flour. Even old reed baskets, frayed and brittle, get rewoven into slippers. One man shows you his pair with proud grin. Still holds up, he says, unless it rains. And then he shrugs like rain in Egypt is myth anyway. But what really catches your eye is the paper. Well, papyrus to be exact. Stacks of it. Some scraped clean and reused, others layered with corrections, crossed out spells, half-finished inventories, and fragments of love notes that somehow end next to tax lists. There's something a little poetic about it. Even ink got second life here. Temple ink, faded from overuse, was sometimes blended with soot or even old wine to revive its color. The result, murky, unpredictable script. But sacred all the same. And the scribes, they were champions of creative recycling. One particularly tired-looking scribe lets you peek into his case. Inside, 2 cracked reed pens bound with linen threads, wax tablet that had clearly been used for both prayer drafts and snack lists, and bit of crumbled charcoal wrapped in leaf. For emergencies, he says, me nod. You've had those days too. Historians still argue whether this level of repurposing was necessity or ritual. Did they believe that reusing holy materials imbued their next purpose with sacred strength, or was it just the most practical way to handle temple waste without offending any deities? Either way, there's something intimate about it. Every object here has been touched, used, altered, and touched again. Nearby, child is turning leftover dye into finger paint, making smudgy lotus flowers on broken plank. It's for Heather, she says solemnly. You resist the urge to ask if Heather appreciates abstract art. And let's not forget the culinary weirdness that bubbled up here. One of the repurposers opens jar and proudly offers you spoonful of something dark, gelatinous, and slightly vinegary. Stewed offerings jelly, he says. Apparently, after temple meals were cleared away, leftover meat drippings and vegetable stock were sometimes boiled down into thick paste. Add salt, few crushed beans, and some dried herbs, and you got what might be generously called sacred spread, popular with elderly workers who had few teeth but strong stomachs. Some of these repurposed foods even crossed into superstition. You overhear someone say that chewing on stale barley cakes left over from funerals could help ward off nightmares. Another swears that a pinch of burned fig mash scraped from the bottom of an overbaked loaf was good luck when carried in shoe. You decide not to question that one too deeply, then there are both. That's the matter of old amulets, broken scarabs, cracked faience beads, chipped figurines of gods too sacred to toss, too damaged to reuse. Or so you'd think. Here they're ground into powder and added to clay mixtures used for house blessings. A bit of ancient magic pressed into the very bricks. Imagine a wall humming faintly with reused protection spells, sort of spiritual patchwork quilt. You find yourself next to an open crate labeled odds filled with objects whose purposes have long since been forgotten. Single sandal, copper ring with a no stone, cracked bowl painted with faded ibis. Each item once discarded, now awaiting its next incarnation. It's almost comforting, this belief that nothing really ends. It just changes shape, gets a little weirder, and keeps going. You pause as someone lights a small incense bundle, made you're told from crushed offering flowers, sandalwood shavings, and the ash of an old sacred scroll. The scent is sharp and strange, like smoke and honey mixed with ink. It curls into the night air, winding around you, settling in your clothes. And maybe that's the point. In ancient Egypt, even ash had purpose. As you walk away, you glance back one last time. The repurposers are laughing now, sharing flatbread with something suspiciously sweet. One of them lifts his piece in salute. You return the gesture, feeling oddly full, not just from the imagined taste of fig jelly, but from the quiet comfort of knowing that even the most forgotten things still had stories to tell.